Welcome to the Next Best Thing podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Cline-Thomas. So happy to be with you today. I've really appreciated all the feedback on all of the episodes. But one thing that I am hearing more and more is that people are saying, I don't want to make a 180 in my life. I want to make an incremental change. I might want to stay within my same industry, or I want to stay within my same company, but I know I need to be in a different place. So my next is within kind of the bubble that I've created for myself right now, but I still need it to look a little bit different. And so my guest today is a master at that, Mandell Crawley. He is the Chief Human Resources Officer at Morgan Stanley. He's been at the company since he was an intern, not that long ago, because you're still very, very young. But you've been able to navigate this huge company in such an expert way. You've had so many different jobs. We'll talk about that. But Mandell, thank you so much for being here today. We're so excited that you're on.
Well, thank you, Andrea. It's great to be with you, and congratulations to you and your team on this great platform that you've launched. You got quite the story yourself, but I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I can't wait to dive into this discussion, and I'm just doing a lot of background research on you. We're not going to go chronologically, so if that's okay, I want to start kind of where you are right now as the Chief Human Resources Officer, and really kind of set the stage, because you've had this job since February 2021 of what 2020 was for all of us, right? With COVID and especially being in New York City, with the social justice movements, with corporate America being put on notice, hey, we need to and the recognition that changes need to be made. And you at the time were the head of private wealth management, which for me, I'm on the outside, financial services, not my lane. But I'm thinking you're dealing with ultra high net worth clients. Like, that is the bread and butter. Like, you made it, right? It doesn't matter if you're black, brown, blue, purple. There is quantitative measurements. There is a direct value add. And then they say, hey, Mandell, we want you to go ahead and lead, the culture and people of this organization. Why was that even appealing to you?
Wow, this might be a therapy session. This could be a very long podcast. You framed it so right. I didn't wake up one day and say, hey, I'd love to lead human resources for Morgan Stanley. I've been at the organization for 3 decades, and I'm sure we'll unpack that. But I was very much enjoying my remit running our private wealth management business. Within that business, there was an international wealth management franchise. Sports and entertainment was another component. So there was a lot of dare I say, intellectual stimulation that came with that remit. It's a relationship-driven business, so you're meeting a lot of interesting families, multi-generational, multi-jurisdictional families. You're dealing with a lot of complexity. And I'm competitive. There's a competitive urgency to it. Last I checked, Morgan Stanley is not the only, wealth management provider, in the marketplace. And it was the early fall of 2020, when, to your point, the world clearly dealing with COVID, and in the wake of Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and that catalyzed that effort. We were obviously dealing with a lot of that, and our CEO had engaged me on it. And initially, my inclination was to say no. And I said no. I want to say no for a number of reasons. One was I was very much enjoying what I was doing. 2, I think it's really important for folks of color to be leading businesses and not in infrastructure functions. 3, candidly, I didn't want to be the person who was going to, solve the firm's diversity, challenges, right? Just to be really, blunt about it. So for all of those reasons, I had a little bit of pause, but we have, our chairman and CEO is one of the most consequential CEOs in financial services, and what he's been able to do over the last, now 14 years has just been extraordinary. And in talking with my board of advisors, if you will, and thinking about what I would benefit from on some level, so being a little selfish, but also how I was going to be able to be at the center of a lot of the key things that the firm was going to be doing to impact our talent across the globe. And ultimately, I want to be a part of that. So I was able to get my head around it. And then I had to reorient my sense of what alpha was or what value creation was, and think about employees like clients. And 2.5 years in, I'm really glad I did it.
Yeah. And how do you kind of figure out what that value add is in a place that's so quantitative, right?
Yeah.
And so HR is not, it is in some ways, but not so
Yeah.
much, right? It's feelings and maybe retention is quantitative, but other things were like,
Yeah.
how do people feel? How do you measure feelings? How do you measure? And you're in banking, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's so quantitative.
No, it's a great question. I think that was, again, one of the reasons that gave me a bit of pause is, what's the scoreboard? How do you keep score? How do you know you're adding value? But Andrea, I'll tell you, in the final analysis, these institutions are primarily comprised of people. Like at Morgan Stanley, we don't manufacture products. We don't have inventory of physical goods sitting somewhere. We are a relationship-based, talent-driven, organization, right? So the proverbial, our greatest asset is going up and down the elevators every single day. And so when I was thinking about, the human capital agenda at Morgan Stanley, for all the things that we've talked about, the backdrop of that, and to win in the marketplace, candidly, you've got to have, talent. And then from a cultural perspective, you got to ensure that there's a level of collegiality. There's this ethos of collegiality that's happening across the ecosystem. So, HR, I've come to really appreciate the function. You're right. We're not driving revenue, per se. We do manage, the expense base a bit. But when it comes to the soul of the firm, in some respects, we're in the middle of a lot of that, and so it's been fantastic to be able to put my fingerprints on the firm in this way.
So when you go in, how do you assess what needs to be done versus maybe what you can get done, and bridging that divide, if there was one?
It's a fantastic. Well, I forget this is what you do. I mean, these are. I mean, I'm sure I'll be crying before this session is over. You're asking this, you're digging deep. I think all organizations have an element of their virtues, of those in any organization that you really want to hold on to. And when in my early days in leading this organization, I saw that pretty clear. Some of our coverage teams, our business partners that work side by side with the business, and the things that they had gone through together, there was clearly a high level of respect there. But then there was also vulnerabilities. And one of the things that I observed specific to the HR organization is that our infrastructure, we had really great people, really great talent. My predecessor was fantastic, but we hadn't invested in technology that you need to scale a lot of your talent related initiatives, because the rate of change at Morgan Stanley, from 2019 to 2021, I mean, we had grown about 40%.
Oh, wow.
And we had acquired a couple of companies along the way. So there was an extraordinary amount of growth. But your question is right. I think, while I have been in this organization and grown up in this organization, so I obviously had my point of view, but I'm really big on listening. And so I spent a great deal of time, within the firm, talking to folks inside HR, outside of HR, but I also spent a lot of time with peers outside of not just Morgan Stanley, but outside the industry, and just trying to get a sense of what was possible, what good looked like, and then you can start to assess our gaps to what that was, and then you assemble the right leadership team to help you along the way, and you sort of lean into it. And again, we've been at it for a couple of years, and we've made some progress.
Yeah. So what does that progress look like? What are some of the initiatives, I guess, that have your fingerprints, as you said, all over it?
Yeah, I'll start with the big one. The big one is, just strengthening the social contract with our employees. The talent marketplace has just been, to say extraordinary is simply an understatement. Obviously we all know the pressure testing we all felt during COVID. And we've got 80,000 employees in 40 countries around the world. And as we all know, COVID was hitting, the waves were hitting in an uneven way. I mean, while things may have been progressing, frankly, just staying here in the U.S., in certain states, other states were being challenged. And then, when I first stepped into the job in February, India, and we have, 15,000 folks on the ground, in a couple of cities there. And the scale of death that was happening at that time was just simply,
Wow.
again, it's hard to put words to it. And Morgan Stanley, we lost 25 employees
Wow.
during COVID, and hundreds of hospitalizations. And as you know, Andrea, we, everybody knows somebody who's lost a loved one, and we couldn't, memorialize them how we normally would have, just because of where the world was at that time. So that was that, being involved in the health and well-being, being there when our people needed them most was one thing that jumped out. The other thing that I'm really proud of is just the broader scaffolding that we put around our employees, because there's been second order issues like mental health challenges, and not just for our associates, but for their kids. And so there's been a lot of programming that we've put in place around that particular issue, and then we became a more flexible organization. If there was a silver lining to the pandemic, is that it catalyzed institutions who had a certain orthodoxy in terms of how we thought about work, and being physically present, and we all just sucked up the commutes, et cetera. And we, as a leadership team, came to the conclusion that the world had in fact changed. And while we acknowledge that our apprenticeship model matters to our culture, and we believe in learning in the flow of work, so we do want to get our teams together, but we also, acknowledge the fact that, we can do a little bit of both and, right? So we can have our teams together, but also be more flexible. So being in the middle of helping us think through what the future of Morgan Stanley was going to be from a flexibility perspective was another big win for us. And so where we landed was 3+ days, in the office, depending on, where you sat in the firm's, ecosystem, and what your remit ultimately was. And so I think that was well received. And then on the D&I front, as I mentioned at the beginning, there was some reluctance, because I felt like I can obviously have impact, and frankly was having impact, from the seat that I was in. But now being at the center of it with the broader leadership team, I've been proud of how the firm has responded, and we did a couple of things, and I'll land this plane, partner. We, like many corporations, we made many declarations of what we wanted to do in the wake of particularly when George Floyd was killed. We had these core values that have been with Morgan Stanley for, over 85 years, put clients first, lead with exceptional thinking, do the right thing, and give back to our communities. And we had always said that the commitment to diversity and inclusion and belonging was part of do the right thing. But in the wake of this happening, we made an explicit fifth core value, commit to diversity and inclusion. And we've been really big on the spirit of belonging. Everybody should feel like this is their firm. But we took it way further than that, beyond the words, beyond the rhetoric. We established a board of thought leaders, educators, community leaders who care a lot about this space, and frankly would have no qualms about holding Morgan Stanley accountable to doing the things that we said we were going to do. And I thought it was really important for our chairman and CEO to chair this. Right. So this is not the remit of HR. This is the guy who actually, leads the firm, chair at this board. So that was one. And then we put in place some hard, back to your point about metrics, some hard objectives about what we wanted to do. We said we wanted to grow our Black officers by 50% in 3 years. We wanted to grow our Black MD, our partners, if you will, by 50%. We wanted to grow our women population by 25%, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I can tell you, come January 2024, when the sort of the term comes up, 4 of the 6 goals that we put in place, we're going to hit. Importantly, including our Black officers and our Black MDs. So I give you that just to simply just give you a sense of that agenda. There's some other things that we're doing on the tech side, but I'll leave it there, Andrea. I appreciate the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and it kind of flows into my next question. Is that, quite frankly, like a lot of people that I talk to, both personally and then on this podcast, they ended up leaving their situation because they're mainly people of color, right? Mainly Black women, because corporate became untenable. Right.
Yeah.
It just really was, where, all the places had the commitments, had the, beautifully worded statements, but the reality in the workplace did not reflect that. And there was no accountability. And so it just became an untenable situation. So what should people look for now that you're inside? Because I can recognize that there are going to be blind spots. Everybody wants change to happen very fast, right? But historically, it always is incremental and it takes time, right? And it's the endurance that's so painful, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So what metrics should people really be looking at in their companies that have professed changes, that show that change is actually happening and it's not just, they're not being paid lip service?
Oh, that's again, I'm glad you asked me that. I think about it in 2 frames. The first frame could be really frustrating, and you talked about the numbers. So at Morgan Stanley, the denominator again is 80,000, or if you just stay here in the U.S., it's 52,000 folks. And the numerator is much smaller than that, right? When you're talking about whether it's, women, or you're talking, Black, brown, communities, et cetera. And then, the reality is the talent marketplace is really dynamic. So you've got folks in that numerator that are coming in and out all the time. And so just when you think you're making progress, you have somebody who gets an extraordinary opportunity away from, the firm, or somebody who decides to maybe start their own business or whatever it is. But there was something that they were running towards, and you lose them regrettably. So it hurts your numbers, but the numbers are important. We measure everything that we care about. We obviously measure revenue, we measure pre-tax profit, we measure new asset flows or what have you. And if you're going to be intentional about anything, as you and I both know, you got to actually know if you're making progress. And so there is a quantitative piece. And I gave you a quick summary of how we think about that. But the other frame is one that you can actually achieve much quicker. And that is this sense of, and I used the word earlier, as belonging. How do you create a culture where, folks feel like, even if they are one of few, right, in a room, they actually feel like this is their firm. And it's easy to say, but it's actually really hard to achieve. And I think this gets back to, how collegial a place is and how intentional, your leaders and your managers are in pulling people in so that they feel like, I'm not just being included here, like meaning where you invited me here. I actually feel like I belong here. And I'll close this with, I sit on the 40th floor of Morgan Stanley, which is our C-suite, our executives sit there. I'm a couple doors from our CEO. And I think I'm the first Black person to, actually have an office on that floor, just, from a historical perspective.
Oh, wow.
And when folks come into my office, again, back to this idea of being intentional, on one wall, I have Biggie Smalls. Standing on the Brooklyn Bridge with the Coochie sweater on and the shades. And then on the other wall, I have Common, because I'm a Chicago boy.
Chicago, right.
And Kanye was
I
a
was
bit
about
too
to
much.
say,
Kanye was too much. I couldn't
I
get,
was going to bring it up. I knew it would be a little sore
yeah,
subject.
a little controversial. So, but I have it there on purpose because when folks, particularly folks who look like you and I, come in there, I want them to know when we talk about being authentic, right? We are of the hip hop generation. Like, I want them to know this is who I am. I'm not just this guy in a suit and tie or what have you. So this idea of belonging, I think, is something that organizations can achieve much sooner. So even though your numbers may not be where you want them to be, have you created an environment where folks can truly feel like they belong at the place? It takes a lot of work, but you can do it.
Yeah, and let's go back to how you even started, since you brought up Chicago, right? And so you got into Morgan Stanley through a high school internship, through your vocational high school, and was one of five, right? One of five people to get this this work study program. But even though you were coming in Chicago, even though you were coming from the west side of Chicago, I imagine downtown was close in proximity, but very far away in many other ways. So talk about how you felt like you belonged, or was it just a means to an end? And highlight your background in terms of you had to get to work, right? Like, so you had faced a lot of challenges at that point in your life.
Yeah, this is where I might cry.
Oh man,
No,
stop.
I would tell you, and this is something I know is so true in your family, and education being just so important, and being raised by my grandparents, they weren't formally educated, but there was an expectation that, not only do you go to, were you going to school, but, there's an expectation that you were going to do well. So I always talk about education, super important. Effort is, essential. And then of course, exposure. And to your point, going downtown, putting on a suit and traveling downtown for someone who was less than 5 miles away from it, in terms of, proximity. But it was a world that, was just, it might as well have been on the West Coast. You just didn't go there when you were in the inner city. And this internship that I just happened to get, I showed up, to the interview with a gold suit on, a black shirt, and a black and gold tie. And that was my Sunday's best. I mean, we were a big church going family and Southern Baptists, and that attire was well received in that environment. So I show up to this interview, thinking that, look at these guys, I'm dressed way better than these guys. So it just shows you, sometimes being a little naive can be a good thing. But as you mentioned, I'm one of three boys. My two brothers and I were very close. We're 2 years apart. I'm the middle kid, and we lost our parents early. My mom, passed away. She was a baby. She was 22 years old. Complications delivering my younger brother, and our dad. They were high school sweethearts. My dad had 3 sons. He was 22. Just in the military, and he was overwhelmed, and he was never the same. And life, in many ways crushed him, but alcoholism, drugs, etc. And he ultimately was killed when he was only 39 years old. So he was a young man. But we had our grandparents, as I mentioned, had migrated from Mississippi and had already raised their kids, and then they took us on. And my grandmother, who was everything, Andrea, she was everything to us. She passed away suddenly when I was 16. And so from that moment, I had to become an adult in some respects. I had a younger brother to look after, and And almost a year to the day she passed away October 12th, 91. October 5th, 1992, I start working at Dean Witter Reynolds, which is a predecessor firm to Morgan Stanley. And 30 years later, I'm on this great podcast with you, recounting that story.
That is amazing, because like when I was thinking about it, I was like, Morgan Stanley never had somebody like you on their bingo card, right? And part of the foundational question of this podcast is, how do you navigate spaces that were created without you in mind, right? And so you have been able to, you've had so many different jobs within the business I'm going to read it because I don't know financial stuff, right? So I'm just going to.
I think you're pulling my leg. I think you know plenty.
No, I really don't. Oh, wait, no, I didn't even put it. So I know you were doing trading, sales and trading, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then, and you always ended up leading the business. That's you're very competitive and always, but then going to become a chief marketing officer.
Yeah.
And you call yourself not creative, right?
No.
And then you're in the private wealth space to heading the private wealth, and then getting to where you are right now. So one of the things I really wanted to know was, how did you even create the space for you to be considered for these other jobs for which you didn't have all of the skill sets? It wasn't a linear progression.
No, I mean I say to young people all the time, careers are not, and your own story is a great example of that. I mean, careers are not linear; they're circuitous. And my journey, clearly is evidencing of that. I think it should be said, I benefited from a couple of things. And one is just being born at the right time, right? In some respects. Two, at my firm, when I started at the journey in '92, Morgan Stanley was a 4,500 person company with a market cap of less than $7 billion. Today it's 82,000 and we have a market cap, in or around $150 billion. So just being proximate to growth creates tailwinds. I think that, part of our ethos, moving talent around the ecosystem, I've been a beneficiary of that. But I think more to the heart of your question, I tend to ask myself, 4 questions, and I hope your listeners, can benefit from this. When it comes to, is it time to move and pivot? The first question is, am I learning? Am I still learning? Second question, am I still growing? Third question, am I still having impact? Am I having the impact that I want? Or am I in a seat that allows me to have continued impact? And then last but not least, which is super important, and learning a bit of your story, I know you can relate to this, am I happy? Right? So am I learning? Am I growing? Am I having impact? Am I happy? And if you can't answer yes to all 4 of those questions, it may be time to start thinking about your next. And then the question I oftentimes get, okay, all right, if you once you figured out that maybe it's time, how do I sort through, what I should be going to, right? Some folks have a view of that, right? Like I love how you talk about, I'm still doing my plan A, right? It just looks a little different. Right. So it's not a plan B, but it's like, how do I, take the things that I enjoy and apply them? And there's this framework that I use. It's 3 concentric circles. One is, what am I really interested in? Right. What gets me out of bed in the morning? 2 is, which I think is really important, what are my superpowers? Right? What are the capabilities that I have that are not easily replicated? And then number 3, back to the word that I used before, is growth. Where's growth happening? Because whether you're doing the corporate hustle like I'm doing, or the guy we both love, you start to, you launch your own
Yeah.
business and firm, you have got to be where growth is ultimately happening, because growth ultimately drives optionality over time. And I surely benefited from that.
But still, how do you convince the other person
Mm,
who might be seen as a gatekeeper that, like,
yeah.
what you got on the inside, right? Like, well, I haven't done this in the fullness of this job yet, but I
Mm,
know that my skills can transfer. But they're saying, oh, but you've always done this,
sure.
So for me, being a reporter, they're like, oh,
Mm,
you're in front of the camera. You
mm,
can't, you maybe not, you can't lead teams, or you can't, but
right.
I know that I can. So what's the pitch?
Totally.
What are you saying in those rooms?
Yeah.
Break that down.
Now, it's so funny. We love to put, when we all do it on some level, right? To typecast folks and put
Yeah.
them in a box. I'd say a couple of things. Particularly, Black folks. I oftentimes say, and this is not mine, others have said this, but we're over mentored and under
Mhm.
sponsored.
Right.
The reality is, to make moves happen, particularly in a corporate context, or even if you're an entrepreneur, investors, like folks who are willing to give you capital to scale, et cetera, you need sponsorship. Somebody has got to put their thumb on the scale, right, to help open that door for you. But I think there are three attributes that we all must have, because, as you know, moving and pivoting is not easy. I mean,
Hmm.
it's a J curve. I mean, you move to a new area, a new domain, right? Going to marketing, I knew nothing. I didn't even know what a bathroom was, right? It took a year to actually figure out what I was really doing. So it takes courage to do these things. But I think there's three things. Number one, there's a high degree of self-confidence. I mean, your self-talk, your belief system, whatever it is that you do to remind yourself who you are, I think is it's the bedrock of everything. So confidence is one, not cockiness, confidence.
Hmm.
Two is you got to learn to manage the insecurities, right? The insecurity of walking into rooms where folks may know more about a thing than you do, but still having the confidence to articulate the things that you ultimately want for it yourself. Be less worried about, did I say it the right way, or am I being too aggressive? I mean, there's just an insecurity that comes with being, I'll just say for myself, Black man in an industry that wasn't, to your point, originally designed for me. And I go back to the point of, again, being born at the right time.
Hmm.
And then lastly, I'd also say this important is impulse control, because a lot of times, you want things to happen faster than they do, and sometimes things take longer to materialize, and sometimes we could be overly impulsive and say, okay, well, that's not going to happen for me, so let me go over and do something else. And so I've had a bit of patience, if you
Hmm.
will, as it relates to this journey that I've been on. But if nothing else, partner, I will emphasize this point, which I hadn't always known, but just the inconvenient truth that no one's going to care about your career as much as you do,
Right.
and we have got to learn to be appropriately edgy in managing our career. And it's okay to be grateful, but within a range. And that, because sometimes folks will say, well, you should just be grateful for being where you are, and you should sort of manage your ambition. And I completely disagree with that.
Yeah. So how do you create agency? How did you create that agency? Because it's a cumulative
Yeah.
impact.
Duration, I've been at it for a long time, and so I have much greater clarity of what value I bring. I have much greater clarity of who I am, and I'm not afraid to use my voice. And then, as you get further along in your career, et cetera, you get to a place where you feel like you can take greater risk. Candidly, your brother has
Hmm.
been, pretty instrumental in sort of pushing me. And I know from the outside in, it's like, well, he stayed at one place. But as I said before, the place has grown so much and it's changed so much through acquisitions. And frankly, the reason I've stayed for as long as I have is because I've been fortunate to do a lot of different things. But one of the things that we struggle with, I'll just, again, continue to say it in our community, and I know your viewership is much broader than that. And I think women have historically had, some of this issue as well. And that's just agency. Mm-hmm. And given the reality of my family structure and taking care of my brothers and my aunts and my uncles, I have been more conservative for sure. For sure. I applaud like what you're doing, stepping out and saying, you know what, I'm going to bet on myself. That's an extraordinary thing to do. And candidly, we need more people doing that. So success isn't just, oh, you made it to the C-suite of XYZ company. The more of us folks that are starting businesses and creating opportunities for others, I think is the ultimate manifestation of agency.
Yeah. But I think that, Rudolph, when he was on the podcast, he talked about how, he wasn't let in. So it was just like he had no other choice. He didn't feel like he had any other choice. And for me, I would still be in the corporate structure, but I just felt like the roadblocks were just so, so large and would have, in fact, set me back if I stayed,
Sure.
So again, I felt like I did not have a choice. And a lot of people I talked to feel like it wasn't like a bold or courageous move. They just had no other choice when you're ambitious and you know what you're capable of, and the space doesn't create the opportunity. I do want to shift. I could talk to you forever, and I want to be respectful of your time. But I do want to talk to you about money is always a big thing that keeps people from their next. Of man, I don't want to not have this check. I have these conversations with friends all the time, and for me, it was just like, God, I know I'm getting paid a lot less than I should be. And you go in, you're having the conversations and, whatever. And you're like, well, I just got to make it on my own. I just got to figure out and hustle on my own. How should we be managing our money? I know when you were, you've seen how people have gained wealth over time. Let me back up. When you work with, it said ultra high net worth individual. What are we actually talking about here? What does that even mean?
As the word says, ultra. No,
ultra, because of the ultra. I was like, wait a minute,
no, I mean,
what are we talking about here?
I mean, there are folks who, we're all people at the at the end of the day, but there are folks who have amassed so much wealth and families who've amassed so much wealth, and that wealth tends to be, multi-generational. But you obviously, particularly, in the last 25 years, I mean, you have a lot of first generation wealth that was born out of, places like Silicon Valley and other places. But you have folks who are so wealthy, you refer to them as, an individual, like they're a two-legged institution, right? Their money is so, their balance sheet is so big, you actually cover them in a client context like you're covering an institution, even though you're dealing with an individual or a family. And so, just given Morgan Stanley and its collection of businesses, we're able to accommodate, that type of size and sophistication.
All right. Well, so I'm over here rubbing two nickels together. However, what should we really be thinking about? Because the whole idea was that you go to college and college would open up the door, right? But we see that with the student loan crisis, that it actually, in some instances, for some people, if they've amassed too much debt, it's actually a setback. So you're not getting the house early enough. You're not, you know what I mean? You're not establishing in the traditional ways that wealth is amassed here in this country. So what are some things that I guess aren't always talked about? I don't know if there's secrets that they know that we don't, if it's privilege, as you said, generational or whatever, but how can we start planting the seed so that we're, even if it's not with our generation, it's with the next generations, that we're in a much better space? Because that also creates agency. Money creates agency.
Oh, facts. And you almost have to even respond to it. You have to separate the inherited wealth, right? Because you and I both know the world is far from equal.
Mm-hmm.
And, while particularly in this country, we romanticize with, the idea that it's a free democracy and it's a capitalist society. And if you work hard enough, you can be great. And we say those things as if we're all starting at the same starting point. And that's just not reality. So there's a subset of our society that, wakes up or are just born into a situation. And so they've got structural advantages. So let's put them to the side. And I would say to the average person, I always start with spending, right? Because most folks, tend to it's less of an income problem and it's more of a spending problem. Mm-hmm. And this is stuff that we've grown up, in our families, in our communities, some version of stop trying to keep up with the Joneses, right? Stay in your lane, stay in your box. And I learned something very early on, back in those internship years. I remember reading an article in the Chicago Tribune. And in that article, it said, if you invested $2,000 a year, $2,000 a year at the age of 21, and you allow that investment again, to compound over time, just investing in the S&P 500, which is just the market, and assume the historical rate of return for the market of 10%. By the time you retire, you'll have well over $1 million. And for me, again, given the context of my story, et cetera, just the $1 million thing just like got my attention.
Right. And
then just thinking about just $2,000 a year investing, and then just the patience and the discipline, candidly, to continue to compound that investment over time. And that's a phenomenon that everybody should ultimately embrace. It's just the power of compounded, not just interest, but just compounding returns over time, mm-hmm. and how that's ultimately your friend. And so I would say I always start with spending, and then from an investment perspective, I move along a risk spectrum, starting with cash. I think everybody should try to have enough cash that if an event happened, right, again, within reason, you've got some fund. Exactly right. You've got some liquidity. And then the next order is you should invest in the equity market. And if you don't know where to invest, and I'm not a big believer in picking individual stocks and trying to be a professional, just buy the S&P 500, which gets you immediately access to the 500 largest companies in the market. Mm-hmm. And then as you get more sophisticated, you can start to diversify and deploy, capital into other asset classes, different parts of the capitalization curve. The more wealth you accumulate, you want to have some bonds to give you a little bit of balance and mix or what have you. So as you start to earn more and have more discretionary, dollars, you can diversify the portfolio. And then when you get to a level where you are categorically an accredited investor, right, you earn more than $250,000 a year, et cetera, then you can start to look at more sophisticated solutions like private markets, like venture capital, like private equity, like private credit, some more sophisticated solutions that you may not be able to get your money right away, but these are opportunities for you to amass more attractive returns over time. But you can't get involved in those things until you've gotten the foundational elements right. I'll close this on with one point. Like our parents told us, there's no quick way to anything. Anything sounds too good to be true. It generally is.
Right.
And you just think about what happened with crypto. Mm-hmm. And you could be sitting in the barbershop, the hair salon, and the average person is asking you about, Bitcoin. And you're like, ugh, this is going to end in tears. Mm-hmm. Right. And in the early 2000s, it was, pet.com or any new, tech company that was launched at that time. So it takes intentionality. It takes discipline, particularly around the spending piece, and just being, being less focused on accumulating stuff, and understanding the power of compounding, and being as focused on putting capital into the market, and being patient. I think that those are some of the essential things that one needs to be a sound investor and put themselves in position to pass money on from one generation to the next. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, super helpful. And our last thing that we always ask every guest is the segment I call Act Up, ACT. Those are my initials. And it's what people can do right now, today, to get to their next. So you have such a unique view from both managing your own career to now managing people and their careers. What would you say are certain things that people can do right now if they feel stuck and they know that they need a change?
Yeah, so just the premise of the question, I would say, so you've already gone through those 4 questions that I've referenced, and you've come up with a no, right, to one of those questions. And so now you're at this place of, I'm either not happy or I need a change. And then I would encourage you to really pressure test, that Venn diagram, what are you interested in? And forget about, if somebody's in the job, if you're in a corporation or what have you, forget about who's in the job. Just start with, what am I really interested in? Like, I know you love telling stories. So don't limit yourself to a certain archetype or certain, seat. Just say, okay, what do I love to do? Right. And what am I most interested in? So that's that. And then I think just really unpacking and being self-aware, what am I actually really good at? What am I really, really good at? Because I do believe that you have the ability to work harder and longer if it's easier. You can endure a lot, right, when it's easier for you than it is for other folks. And as you and I both know, there's nowhere around burning the calories.
Right.
And then 3, I think having a view of industry structure is very important. Back to this idea of growth, right? Where are the green shoots? Where are the tailwinds, right? Because that's the thing that ultimately, as I said earlier, will fuel optionality over time. So I just think that those 3 basic things, like what lights me up, what am I actually really good at, and then where are the opportunities? And then using your network to help you open doors. And that's something that some communities do that much better than others, but I would be really intentional and be less prideful about, hey, can you make an introduction to so-and-so, or do you know anyone in this space? And I think most people will surprise themselves of how they're like 1 degree removed from somebody who can help put them on.
We are all very connected.
Very connected.
Mandell, I could talk to you. I have so many more questions, but I have to meet you in person.
Yes.
And I have to ask you then. But I really appreciate this. I know you have twin girls. Happy Father's Day. We're recording this before Father's Day. I hope you have a really special day. And I can't wait to chat more. I got more questions for you.
No, same here. And I know you guys are going to love on your dad, over the weekend and do that. And I really appreciate you having me on. And I know we're just meeting, but I'm so proud and impressed with what you're doing. And it's so great to be a small. Thank you.
Thank you so much.